Well, Blake, we've done several of these Vancouver Media Legends shows, and look, the whole series would have been incomplete without our next guest. 88 years young, he is the original voice of the Vancouver Canucks, but of course very aligned with our local baseball club, and we'll have that discussion as well. It's our distinct pleasure to welcome in Mr. Jim Robson to Sekeres and Price.
Good
Jim, thanks.
Good to be anywhere.
Well, you say good to be anywhere, but I see you all the time at Nat Bailey Stadium in your seats just below home plate or just behind home plate. And Jim, the other thing is I see a whole bunch of well-wishers who go on up to you and want a photo or a chit-chat. Tell me what it's like to go to the ballpark and have all these people want to come up and chit-chat with you.
Well, I don't go to the night games anymore, but I do go to quite a few afternoon games, and thanks to Jeff Mooney, I have great seats right back at the plate, and I like to take guests and family members. So, and I enjoy the job they do there. I mean, Andy Dunn and Alan Bailey, they do a terrific job. And I sat next to an agent at the last game I was at, and she said this is the best ballpark in this league. And the players I've talked to, the pitchers, the other teams that sit in front of me in the scout seats, they say this is the loudest stadium in the league. And it's a great ballpark, and it's been kept up very well. And I enjoy going there. And
do you feel like you're in? Do you feel like
a young fan will say, "What are you doing at a baseball game?" And I have to explain that I spent about 12 years in the ballpark when it was AAA Pacific Coast League.
Do you feel like you're walking through a time warp just like we do when you walk inside that stadium still?
Yeah, it looks different. Of course, they brought the fences in. They have the porch in left field, which I don't like as much. I watched a game out there, and it's too far away from the action. So the park is different, and way back in the 50s, it was 9,200 seats with bleachers from the base down to the corners, and quite different than it is now, but of course they've done a great job with the condition of the field and bringing in new grass, and they do everything right. It's a lot of features for the kids and the chicken dance and all this kind of stuff, which wasn't in the 50s. But
no. Did you enjoy calling baseball as much as hockey?
I beg your pardon?
Did you enjoy calling baseball as much as hockey?
Well, baseball was a long season. I mean, in those days there was no split season, and if you were out of the pennant race in July and there was 500 people in the ballpark, those were long years. And in the early 60s, I did the Mounties baseball, the Lions football, the Canucks hockey, and 4 kids. I mean, and what happened in 1969, I applied for a Major League Baseball job, which was a terrible mistake. What was I thinking? 4 kids and a mortgage. I tried to get the job with the Seattle Pilots. Wow. And I got a nice rejection letter from Dewey Soriano, which I still have. Fortunately, I was rejected because the next year, the Pilots moved to Milwaukee. They wouldn't have taken me. And the NHL came to Vancouver. So if I'd got that Pilot's job, someone else would have been the voice of the Canucks, and my whole life would have been different.
Wow.
No kidding.
Well, speaking of that life, born in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and were you not even age of majority, I understand, Jim, when you were first started covering sports at CJAV in Port Alberni?
Well, I always wanted to be a sports announcer from the time I was about 6 years old, listening to Foster Hewitt in front of a big DeForest Crosley radio in Prince Albert. And it was always the Maple Leafs. I didn't like the Maple Leafs. I liked the Boston Bruins. They had Frankie Brimsick in goal, and they had the big line, that was so big in Boston in those days, and they won the Stanley Cup in 39 and 41 when I was a kid. So then we moved to British Columbia, and my hockey career ended there. The rink in the backyard didn't work on Barnston Island at a dairy farm. But anyway, I always wanted to be, and then when I was in grade 11 in high school, I had a visit to New Westminster with Bill Hughes, who was the manager at that time at CKNW. And he said, come back and see me in your last year of high school. So I did, and he let me do an audition, and he gave me the names and addresses of the managers of 7 radio stations around BC. This was 1952. I was 17. And in those days, the stations in the small towns, most don't exist anymore, would hire a young apprentice or something for the summer. So I sent letters around. Some didn't reply. Most rejected. Chilliwack, CHWK rejected. Kelowna, come on up and do an audition. Impossible. Vernon, rejected. But Port Alberni offered me a job. And I went over there and met the manager, and I got my job at $100 a month. And the sports announcer at CJAV, a 250-watt radio station there, had just left. Bob Hall, his name was. He was quite prominent in BC basketball and Salmon Arm later on. And Bob left, and so they didn't have a sports announcer, so all I was doing at the start was writing commercials. That was my job. And a 16-year-old high school girl taught me how to write commercials because she was
a 16-year-old. Oh my gosh.
And so, but they said, go ahead and do the sports, you know. So I did the sports casts, and then come the fall, they said, well, we do basketball here. Basketball's big in Alberni, and we do play-by-play. Do you know basketball? So, of course, I was in the Maple Ridge High School basketball team, getting waxed by Mission every year. And so I did the play-by-play of the Alberni Athletics Senior A basketball team when it meant something. And they won the Canadian Championship in 1955, and I did the play-by-play, and they had great basketball teams coming in from Seattle mostly, American teams. The great Elgin Baylor played 2 games at the old Alberni Athletic Hall.
Get out!
Night, 38 points the next night, and there was no three-point shot or no time clock. And he was between schools, leaving Idaho State to go to Seattle University, and eventually led them to the NCAA final. But that's the kind of players that were coming in to play Alberni. So
was this like semi-pro or was it fully amateur?
They were local. They got jobs. McMillan Bodell would give them a sort of a job. It's like the hockey teams did in the Okanagan. They'd
right.
get a job and they'd play.
Yeah.
There, the basketball players. They brought in a playing coach, captain. He used to be captain of the Seattle U. Elmer Speidel. He was the ideal guy. A fine coach, a good person, who became part of the community. And he was a full-time coach and a playing coach. I was in the hall for the kids to go and practice. And the basketball was good. And they had a memorable playoff in '55. The Vancouver Cloverleafs were a legendary team at that time. And the Alberni and the Cloverleafs went 7 games. And the 7th game went overtime at UBC War Memorial Gym, which was standing room only. And Alberni won it by a single point in overtime to go on to play the Edmonton Town Haulers, who had quite a few Edmonton Eskimo football players in their lineup. And then they won that series because they were all played in Alberni, and the visiting teams couldn't win there. The lighting was poor, the crowd tripped up the officials running on the sidelines, and it was an unusual situation, but it was a lot of fun to be there.
It's a real
true home court advantage there in Alberta.
It's a real shame you can't remember any details about all this, Jim.
That was. Don't ask me what happened last week. But anyway, and then in 1956, I'm sitting in the dugout at a baseball team. The Alberni had a good baseball team, and I didn't get to play much. So the catcher named Ted O'Cranitz says, my son-in-law, or my brother-in-law, is a sports announcer in Vancouver, and he's going to hire an assistant. You should apply for the job. So I did, and it was Bill Stevenson. So he hired me as his assistant. And that's when they did baseball, football, hockey. So when Bill went to the Grey Cup in Toronto in 1956, I did my first pro hockey game, the Vancouver Canucks and the Edmonton Flyers, a good Detroit farm team coached by Bud Boyle. 1956 at the old Vancouver Forum at the corner of Hastings and Renfrew, the building's still there. And so that was my first hockey game, but then when Bill went on an assignment of some kind, like the Lions training camp in Kelowna, I would do the Mountie baseball. And we did the full season of the Pacific Coast League. When Vancouver came in first, Los Angeles and San Francisco were still in the Coast League. It was a big move for Vancouver. And then, of course, the Dodgers and the Giants came in from the east, and everything changed in the Coast League. But it was very good baseball, and I was fortunate to be doing quite a few of the games.
Was that when you were doing the road games with the feed and the sound effects and all that sort of stuff?
And we had a genius. I think he's still living in Victoria, named Ron Robinson, who did the sound effects, and we did not use a pencil and a block of wood like you've read about guys doing reconstructed sounds. He had all the sounds recorded in the ballpark and put them on carts. He had everything but a broken bat hit he had. So the sound you heard was legitimate sounds of the fastball in the catcher's mitt or a foul ball back to the screen or whatever. And we were a half an inning behind, and of course we did all the games, and this team was playing double headers on Sunday. You'd be sitting in the studios in Broad Street doing a double header. But when Bill left in 1960 to go to CFRB in Toronto, then I moved into his chair, so I got to do hockey, football, baseball. Did 5 years of the lines. But in those days, 2 stations did all the CFL games in each city. CKNW did it with Jim Cox, so they had the audience, and I was at CKWX. But I did 5 years of Lions football. Then in 1965, the CFL, with their advertising people, got smart and put the bids up, and so only 1 station per market started doing that, and we lost the football rights in 65. But that was okay with me because I was doing baseball and hockey, and football was the toughest to do. I mean, you got so many players, you got to know something about, and those days only had a 34-man roster too, but so it was the toughest sport, I thought. But I did a football game in Calgary on a Saturday afternoon, and the next night I did a hockey game in Portland, Oregon. It was so ridiculous, so much. I went to the Grey Cup in 1966. I think it was the Riders versus the Riders. As soon as the game was over, I got a taxi from Empire Stadium to the ferry terminal at Tsawwassen and took the ferry to Victoria to do a hockey game that night. I mean, it was unbelievable.
It was Riders versus Riders at Empire Stadium. In fact, it was the first Grey Cup for those Green Riders in 1966.
So
Jim,
it was an interesting time, but it was tough. My wife was terrific. We had 4 kids, and she was at home, and I was traveling. But I enjoyed the work. Let's face it; it was what you wanted to do all your life.
Yeah, Blake's already commented on your memory. Remember seeing you at Red Robinson's tribute at the Commodore back in March, and you walked straight up to Jeff Patterson and I upon arrival, and then started telling us stories about just how big Red was, and citing the City Track and Field Championships and how that was always a massive event, not just for the track and field, but because Red was there spinning records and entertaining all the teens. Greg Douglas said to me, Matt, going into this, understand the man has the most amazing memory I've ever come across. Is it just natural, Jim? Do you do any memory exercises or anything like that? How do you explain being able to remember so much that has happened in your extraordinary life in such great detail?
Well, like you guys and a lot of people that follow sports, you can remember a lot of things. As a kid, you could remember the batting averages of major league players, and there were only 8 teams in each league, and so it's easy to remember the stuff from a long ways back, it seems. I can give you the lineup. The Vancouver Mounties in 1959 had an infield of Brooks Robinson at third base, a Hall of Fame, Ronnie Hansen at shortstop, Marv Breeding at second, and Buddy Barker at first. All went to the major leagues. But Brooks Robinson, one of the greatest third basemen of all time, his career almost ended in Vancouver. He went off at third base to field a foul ball. They had a screen in front of the dugout at third base side with metal hooks holding it up, sticking out. As he reached up and catched the ball, the hook caught him just by the elbow, ripped all the tendons from his elbow to his wrist, blood pouring out of his arm. A Dr. Bjarnason was sitting in the box seats, went through that little door by the dugout, went on, wrapped his arm in a towel, took him out to the parking lot, drove Brooks Robinson to Royal Columbian Hospital, where Dr. Bjarnason worked, stitched him all up. He was on the disabled list for about a month. Then he came back, hitting about .340, and after about 45 games in Vancouver, went to Baltimore, then to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. But
wow.
Great times, really.
So bring me back to 1970 then. Now the Vancouver Canucks are moving into the big leagues. They're moving to the National Hockey League. What did you think at the time? Did you know this will be the big team in our city and in our province? And tell us about your association and how you got over to the Canucks play-by-play booth in the NHL.
Well, I hope I'm not going too long in these stories, but in 1970, I'm doing the Western League Canucks, and Punch Imlock and Joe Crozier had loaded the team, and they had very good Western League teams because they thought they were going into the NHL, but in the following exchanges of the ownership and everything, they got bounced out. But anyway, I got a call in March of 1970 and asked if could I go to Oakland and do the radio play-by-play of a Toronto Maple Leaf Oakland Seals NHL game, my first NHL game. I said, oh sure, I'd be happy to do that. Foster Hewitt didn't want to go to Oakland in March to see two teams missing the playoffs. So I go down to Oakland, and the afternoon of the game, the phone rings in my hotel room, and I get told, go to the rink early. The Maple Leafs have just traded Tim Horton. Wow. So I get my Euro tape recorder and I head for the Oakland Coliseum, which I had done some Western League games in. So now I go to the Leaf dressing room, hammer on the door, wait. Joe Skro, the trainer, comes to the door, said, yeah, what do you want? He didn't know who it was, of course. No one did there. So I said, I'd like to speak to Tim Horton. I've been asked to, no, he's too busy right now. Bang, slams the door in my face. So I wait a while, I hammer on the door again. Joe Skro comes to the door again. I said, I'm waiting to see if I can talk to Tim Horton. Of course, there was no scrum. There was no media around. And so he said, no, he's tied up right now. So now I'm starting to worry. We're coming close to warm-up time. I want to watch both teams in the warm-up. My first NHL game. Still no Tim Horton. Now the door opens. A broad-shouldered guy in a top-coated shirt and tie walks by. It's Tim Horton. He walks across the foyer and goes into an area underneath the stands where the Warriors' seats were stored for basketball. Tim Horton, me, following him. Tim, I call his name. He doesn't turn around. He keeps walking. Tim, finally he turns around. I said, I'm Jim Robson from Vancouver, and I'm doing the Leaf game on radio tonight. They'd like me to interview you for the first intermission. And he looked at me, and there were tears pouring down his face. He was crying. He had just said goodbye to Dave Keon, George Armstrong, Norm Allman, all these Maple Leafs that he had played with. In those days, stars didn't get traded. So I chickened out. Non-professional, but I said, well, Tim, it does not look like a good time to do an interview. Good luck in New York. Now what? I've got no interview, my first game. But the general manager of the Leafs who made the trade was Jim Gregory, and I knew Jim because he had coached the Western League Vancouver Canucks one year, and we traveled together. So I found him in the rink, and I said, Jim, I got this problem. I didn't interview Tim because he was so upset, and he's just about to catch the plane to New York. Would you come on and talk about the trade? So he saved my bacon.
Oh, very nice.
In the first intermission, came on to talk about the trade. But that was my first NHL game. And then, of course, I knew that was like an audition. The McLaren Advertising wanted to hear my job. And then come the next summer, Bill Hughes came to me at a luncheon or something and said, would you leave CKWX to do NHL hockey? I said, of course I would. So both WX and NW applied for the rights to broadcast NHL hockey, and I was told later that my name was in both presentations. NW, who had the great promotion department with John Plule, and they were the king of the hill, and so they got the rights. So now I'm negotiating to do NHL hockey, and the money wasn't that great. I was a very poor negotiator. Mel Cooper was the manager then, and he was offering me much like what I was making working around the clock at WX. So Alan McEachran was the president of the BC Lions, a very prominent man in BC law later on. And Al asked me one day, how's the negotiations going on the hockey? I said, well, not that great, Al. I said, and so he had arranged a luncheon with me and and Cooper at the University Club, which no longer exists, by the Marineville. So we have a nice lunch and nobody talks about my situation at all. It doesn't come up. So we're leaving. And after lunch, we're on the sidewalk, and McEachern, who had a lot of clout in the city, turned and said, "Mel, you could do better on that offer to Jim." Went up $3,000 with that one line.
Oh, wow.
He never sent me a bill either. But anyway, so I got the NHL hockey, but my contract was not, again, I didn't negotiate. I didn't have an agent or anything, but I had to pay Jim Cox $125 a game out of my pocket when I did Hockey Night in Canada and he did the radio.
Oh,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah.
And I had to work for a month in the summer while Al Davidson went on vacation. I did all the sports. And that was part of my contract. But anyway,
Wow.
It was NHL hockey. And I got to do some Hockey Night in Canada games, and of course, and including the very first one ever. But it's a good trivia for Vancouver sports. Who did the radio play-by-play for the Canucks' first NHL game? Danny Gallivan.
Wow.
CKNW brought him in to do the first game. He and Al Davidson did radio, and I did the TV. So
Wow.
that's the start of it. And
Well, and of course, at Hockey Night, you covered Stanley Cups as well, Jim. And closer to home, boy, I still hear people talking about how great it was to listen. And I know you had many a broadcast partner, but listening to you and Tommy Larscheid call the games over the years, what was the secret of the chemistry that the two of you had together in that broadcast
you'll have
booth?
to ask Tom about this, but it was a tough sled at the start. I had worked alone all those years.
Yes.
I was old school. And Tom used to be frustrated because he was personality, and he used to say to me, "Robson, loosen up. This is not World War III. We are in the entertainment business."
Yeah.
Entertainment business? I never thought of myself as an entertainer. But Tom was an entertainer, and he was right. He changed the sound of hockey broadcasts in this market. And he and John Shorthouse, and now Shorthouse and Garrett, are entertainers.
Mm-hmm.
They get it. And it bothers me sometimes when I hear Shorty and John talking about what they had in the pregame meal, or their daughters in the stands, or the family had a good mark in mathematics or whatever. We never talked about stuff like that. But this is part of being personalities, and it's entertainment. And I was old school, and I thought I was more of a reporter than an entertainer.
Jim, talk about the 70s when they had struggles, or gosh, right into the 80s for that matter. And particularly if you were alone, but even if you had Tommy or anybody else sitting beside you, how hard was it to broadcast year after year of losing during that time? You had to wait a long time to call exciting seasons, if you will. You had exciting games from time to time, I'm sure, but to call a winner, you had to wait a while. What was it like to grind out non-playoff years and losing seasons with the Canucks?
Well, today people say, look at Vegas. They win the Cup after only 6 years. Look at Seattle in the playoffs second year. The way that they paid $65 million to get in the NHL, they'd better get a competitive team. The old days when the team expansion came in, they got nothing to pick from. And the expansion, remember the records of the Washington Capitals and the New York.
Oh, my
terrible.
goodness.
So you accepted the losing, but the travel was extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
We used to have 3 7-game road trips in the East every year, when the boat show, the home show, and Ice Capades moved into the Coliseum. You would play
Yeah.
Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday in 4 different cities. And then you'd come home after playing Sunday night in New York, not charter flights. Sunday or Monday morning, early, you'd take the bus to the airport, fly New York to Toronto. Hang around the Toronto airport, fly Toronto to Vancouver, 5 hours. Shuffle into a bus and go to a practice Monday afternoon. Imagine what kind of a practice that would be. And then play Tuesday night against a team that was 20 points better than you in the standings.
Yeah.
I mean, it was tough in the 70s. It really was. But as far as the broadcasts go, I think Tom and I, our peak was the 94 playoffs. And it was the toughest conditions to broadcast in Madison Square Garden. We were up in the stands and one end of the rink, near the back row, right around the spectators. 4 big guys in front of us wearing Ranger sweaters. And when they came back to tie in Game 6, they thought they're, or Game 5 I guess it would have been, they thought they were going to win the cup. These big guys put their fists right in our face and said, "You're going to win the cup now, you know." And Tom was going to take them on. And I pulled Tom back. I said, "Tom, if they act up, we're in trouble. There's no help around here." So, and they went to Mr. Bettman and complained about our position. And of course, there was so much TV. There was feeds from Sweden and Russia and the Madison Square Garden and the West and the talking in Canada, French and English. So the visiting radio were up in the rafters, along with Kenny Albert was doing the games for USA Radio or something. And a French-Canadian radio crew was sitting next to us. We didn't even have a monitor to start the series.
Oh.
So, but Tom and I were traveling. At the end of that series, that season, we were just exhausted. I mean, because what happened in those playoffs in '94, both Toronto and Dallas made a mistake. They had an option during the playoffs to play the first 2 games at home, play 3 games in Vancouver, and 2 back home, or play like they do now, 2 at home, 2 on the road, and then 1-1-1 after that. Both Dallas and Toronto went for the 2-3-2 option. Both series ended in 5 games.
5 games.
The Canucks winning on home ice. Now each had 3-0 in Game 5 in that series too. So if Toronto had won that Game 5, we'd go back to Toronto for Game 6 and 7. Look, it makes quite a difference.
Yep.
So, but the Canucks went all the way to the final and came so close. I thought sure they were going to win the Cup. Because the day of the Cup, I'm walking to Madison Square Garden from our hotel, right by Bryant Park and the famous New York City library. And I got my briefcase and I'm walking along by myself. And I hear sirens, and it's a motorcycle, New York City motorcycle crew, police, escorting the Vancouver Canuck bus. And they're going to Madison Square Garden. The bus is going along and I'm looking up, and here's Tim Hunter, who didn't get to play in the final, great guy, and he's sitting in my seat in the bus. But anyway, and I give him the thumbs up. He gives me the thumbs up. I said, the Canucks are going to win the Cup. Well, they came within a goal, right?
Well, they came within a post, Jim.
It was so that for Tom and I, that was, and after that, I quit doing the radio. Pat Quinn told me they were going to split the radio and TV because he didn't like this. We were doing simulcasts on BCTV and NW.
Yep.
So I knew that if I stuck with the radio, someone else would come in and do TV, and TV was coming more prominent all the time. So I quit the radio, although Tom and Shane P. McConnell were doing a football game when they announced I had retired, but I didn't really retire. I just quit the radio. So, but I made the mistake of the first year I was getting paid by the game, and there was no hockey in that first year.
All right.
The lockout. So it wasn't until January where I got to do a game. But anyway, I did local TV. But I did that for 4 years, I guess. And then in '99, which in those years were disastrous, even with McGillney and Burry and Messier, they couldn't get to the playoffs. Anyway, at the end of the '99 season, I told my wife going out the door, last home game of '99, this is it. This is my last game. I didn't tell anybody else, just my wife. So I did the game. That was it. I had to quit. 47 years in broadcasting, and I packed it in then. But as all those years of losing, you know, there were still highlights. The first year Canucks were a competitive group. In December of 1970, one of the highest scoring lines in the NHL was Orland Kurtenbach at center ice, who had been sort of a tough fourth line center with the Rangers and Boston. And the wingers were Wayne Mackey and Murray Hall, a career minor leaguer. They were one of the highest scoring lines in the league. And the next line was Andre Boudria with Rosaire Paymont and Paul Popiel, and that was a good line. So the Canucks were tough. Pat Quinn, and I mean, they had a competitive team. They had 3 goaltenders, which didn't work very well, but Charlie Hodge, George Gardner, and Dunk Wilson, who I thought was going to be a great.
Yeah.
And so even though they wound up sixth, I think Detroit was behind them in the standings. But there were still lots of highlights, and the rink was full. And then it started to sag in the mid '70s, and the crowds dropped off. We had crowds of 7,000 at Canuck games.
Yeah,
And the WHA came along, but the Blazers couldn't outdo the Canucks because the year Phil Maloney took over, the Canucks made the playoffs, and they were in a weak division, but they still made the playoffs. And the Blazers wound up leaving town. But it was a good time, even with losses. And I admire hockey players so much. I like all athletes, but hockey players play such a difficult sport in a confined space. There's no out of bounds. And you got to have a lot of courage. Some have more than others, but they've all got courage. And they play it on skates, on ice. And a lot of people can't stand up on skates. And the critics say that, I used to argue with Jim Taylor, who was, of course, a memorable coverage of the football especially. I'd say, Jim, hockey players have an extra talent. They have to be great skaters just to play in the league. Whereas you play any other sport, you're on your feet. You can fake, you can pivot in soccer, in lacrosse, in basketball, in football, and you're on your feet. It's more natural. But in hockey, you got to be a great skater, and they are. And so
got to balance on a quarter-inch blade of steel, right, at all times. And if anything, Jim, I think this conversation has proved you needed an agent, sir, during several negotiations. But amazing stories there, particularly about '94. And one of my questions here was Greg Adams, or he'll play, he'll play. Are those the two most famous calls that people ask you about?
Well,
is there anything else?
Well, they probably are, but I really mean this. They were not great calls.
I've heard you say this before, that you're not entirely satisfied with either of them.
Adams, I couldn't think of anything else to say, so I said Greg Adams about 4 times. And then when Trevor Linden, and that's so unfair that he had been elbowed by Graves. I didn't see who it was, but it was Graves. Knocked him to the ice, and he was nose was bleeding, and he's down on the ice. Mark Messier comes off the bench in the last minute of a 4-1 game, and Messier gives him a cross-check in the back of the head and drove his face into the ice. Sergio Momesso, one of the leaders of the team, standing at the bench, wanted to jump over and grab Messier, and they held him back. But I saw Linden on the ice, and then he staggers up, and he struggles to the bench, so I say, he's going to play in Madison Square Garden. I should have said, just wound it up, he's going to play at Madison Square Garden for the Stanley Cup. Something like that. But I sort of said, the game is over, meaning that game was over. Mm-hmm. I should have said, the 6th game is over, and then that would have been much better. But
simplicity reigns sometimes, and that was perfect. Don't worry.
Yep. We would be remiss if we didn't ask you, what do you make of these modern Canucks, Jim? It hasn't been a great decade of hockey over at Rogers Arena. What are your thoughts on this club?
Well, I was afraid you would ask me, but I think they'll be competitive and interesting, but we'll have a tough time making the playoffs. You look at the division they're in, and the Central Division that they have to, if they don't finish in the top 3, then who they're going to face in that division. There's about 5 or 6 good teams in that division. Now in the Pacific, I guess it's Vegas and Edmonton that everybody thinks would be 1-2. And now you go to LA, had a good year last year. They should be good again. Seattle made the playoffs. They expect to do it again. That's 4 teams. And now they got Calgary. Nobody really knows what's going to happen in Calgary, but they still have Markstrom. They've got that great leader on defense in Tanev. They've got some good forwards. They're going to be competitive. So that leaves Vancouver, Anaheim, San Jose, which looks like right now the 3 teams that will be out of the playoff picture. But The Canucks seem to have improved their defense. They are counting on some improvements from the crop of forwards, but the key is Demko in goal. He has to stay healthy. He has to play like we know he can. I know Seeloff's is a good prospect, but I think they'd probably leave him in Abbotsford and let him play a lot of games. So Demko has to stand on his head night after night, which he's shown he can do. So I think they'll be interesting and competitive, but I think they'll have a tough time making the playoffs.
Pretty astute.
Yeah,
Pretty astute.
well, I look forward to his weekly spot on
Yes, exactly.
later this season.
Yeah.
Jim, this has been marvelous. Thank you for the time here. Thank you for all the stories and being available. We will see you at Nat Bailey Stadium because, of course, the Seas are going to the playoffs, and we got a lot of games left here in August. And, of course, we'll see you at Rogers Arena come hockey season. Thanks for the time.
Thanks for stopping by.
All right, thanks a lot.
Tackle all the hills with ease and don't arrive at work all sweaty. Get around the city on electric transportation that fits your lifestyle and get it at bestbuy.ca.